As we said, the preference in this chapter is for market-based regulations, but nonetheless we have to go through examples to show why they are preferred, right? Market-based basically means if regulations require reducing emissions, then market-based forces can be brought into effect by either raising the gas prices or putting a tax on carbon. And the idea is that some people would prefer to walk to work, let's say, or to school, or for shopping and so on. And a regulation-based or a command-based policy would force everybody to walk, whether they are or changed their mode of transportation or reduced travel and so on. The idea is that a market-based regulation would just automatically motivate those who are likely to walk anyway. So it automatically stratifies people into what they want to do. Those who want to pay and drive more anyway would drive. Those who would prefer to walk anyway would walk and reduce emissions and feel good that they also saved money by not paying that tax. Command-based policy, on the other hand, would not be able to distinguish people who would be high on the list of being happy to walk versus those who are just not willing to walk, or the social status requires them to drive or whatever. Like country like India or China, for example, even if there is public transportation, often people may prefer to drive to maintain their social status. No data, I'm just saying. The fundamental difference between command-based and market-based policies is in how government chooses who has to take which action. So market-based just basically forces people to align their preferences with the cost of the market-based incentives, whereas command-based will just try to force everybody, even if it's very difficult for them to find public transportation, for example, to go to school, shop, work, and so on. So if the likelihood that people who prefer to walk also end up being the ones who prefer the command-based policy, then it'll work. Otherwise, it doesn't work. But driving and walking is just one action. There are 1,000 other actions. For example, replacing incandescent bulbs. There may be, you can read that some women feel that the CFL lights or LEDs don't give the same feeling at all in terms of just the aesthetics. But there may be some women who don't care. So how do you force both of them to make the appropriate choice? Market-based policies apparently automatically pick cost effectiveness and also respond to technology changes, like going from incandescent bulb to LEDs, and still be aligned with your aesthetic preferences. Carbon tax, which is the most direct and most advocated market-based policy here, and by many economists, as we will see, can also drive changes in the market, like people switching to electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, and so on, and make some kind of a calculation about how much money they would save, even if it's more expensive, or some kind of a enlightened self-interest which would make them switch to EV. Carbon tax creates a price signal that discourages people from buying products that are damaging to climate. So you may be buying a iPhone, because you love Apple products and you like iPhone in particular. But if there is a price incentive on that to reduce emissions, either you would pay for the carbon tax because you prefer to buy it, or you would move away and buy a phone that is less damaging to the environment. Carbon tax also incentivizes a whole series of small actions on energy conservation when taken together can have a transformative effect on climate. So it makes everybody a part of the economy, where you are incentivizing cost-effective ways to reduce emissions. I think you get the message. But there are papers which tell you that just carbon tax is not enough, so projecting a little into the future, here is the emissions in million metric tons CO2 equivalent. This is just US net greenhouse gas emissions going from 2015. So there is the historical emission pathway, which has dropped a little because of a large scale switch to natural gas in some sense in many processes and so on. The projections, on the other hand, with the current policy, the percentage change from 2005 is shown here, is up here, whereas if you put a carbon tax of $50 per ton, we said that the economists have been recommending $40 to $47 per ton in the US. US has no carbon tax right now. But if you made it $50, then you would reduce with respect to 2005 by much more than the current policies, which is a mix of command-based and market-based policies. If you look at the emissions from electric power greenhouse gas emissions from 2020 to 2030, again in million metric tons CO2 per carbon equivalent, you will see that increasing the carbon tax, so the colors here show increasing carbon tax per ton shown here, $14, $50, $73. By 2020 you would go from $17.55 down to $11.19. 2025 is still doing pretty good, and then the efficiency drops because you have in some sense used up the low-hanging fruit of switching to efficient technologies and squeezing out all there is in the system to squeeze out reduction of emission with respect to higher cost in terms of carbon tax. Okay, so new innovations will be needed. Some sort of a game changer may be needed to continue to drive reductions in emissions by simply raising carbon taxes. So if the cost of reducing carbon keeps going up, then the incentives begin to drop. Right? So that's the kind of idea about increasing taxes and expecting returns, as we saw in the revenues of Sweden versus Hungary or Poland and so on. Okay, so every instrument has to have some knob which tunes it with respect to technology availability and the cost of reduction versus cost effectiveness versus incentives.